Thank you, Erin. Oh, I just lost my notes. If you require any technical assistance, please feel free to send a message to ACEC Research Institute privately through the chat box, and I will be happy to assist you. Finally, a short disclaimer: the views of our panelists are their own and do not reflect the positions of their employer or the ACEC Research Institute. Now, allow me to introduce the Executive Director of the ACEC Research Institute, Daphne Bryant, who would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Carrie, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ACEC Research Institute's Board of Directors, welcome to today's Future of Engineering Roundtable. A big thank you to our donors who have made this session possible. We're really excited to share with you today the results of our recent Q2 engineering business sentiment, as well as some other economic insights from our team here today. So allow me to introduce the presenters today. We have Joe Bates, who serves as a research consultant for the ACEC Research Institute, and Erin McLaughlin, who is the Vice President of Private Markets at ACEC. So Joe, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Great, thanks so much, Daphne, and thanks, Carrie. Erin, it is great to be back with you again today. Yes. I always enjoy our chats here, and I hope everybody else will enjoy what we have to share today as well. So today we're going to talk about the economy and how it's doing. It's a really big question right now. And as Daphne mentioned, we're going to bring into the discussion some of the new data hot off the press that we have that we're going to share with our audience today. So we're going to first focus by talking about the U.S. economy as a whole today and where it stands and a few of our thoughts on it. We're then going to focus squarely on the AE industry and see what our data shows about this industry, how we're doing. And then we're going to end with some of our future slides, which is where we're headed or where we might be headed. So with that, let's start with how is the economy doing today? Now, this is a little bit different than it was 3 months ago. So 3 months ago, I was sitting here saying, wow, look at this really strong fourth quarter. Right. And last year as a whole, we had a great year in terms of GDP. And I actually said, it's hard for me to see how we're going to head into a recession with things, even though we had high inflation. But sure enough, in the first quarter, we see GDP fell by an estimated 1.5%. Now, this is not the final reading. The final reading will be coming out just in a couple weeks from now. I don't know if it's going to be revised up or down, but I'm quite certain it will still be negative. Erin, do you concur on that?
I do. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is, anyone who's been listening to the business news, especially the last couple of days, as we've seen, equities, stocks really fall, is there's a lot more talk about the possibility of a recession. And so when economists think about what is the definition of a recession, the accepted definition is generally 2 concurrent quarters of a decline, generally measured by GDP. So recessions are one of those things that we often don't know that we're in one unless we're in one. And obviously they can also be shallow and they can be deep. Our pandemic recession was very deep, but it was pretty quick. So it will, at a negative 1.5, even if it's still negative, we could be entering a shallow recession. And so that when the news on our second quarter comes out, that will be, an indication for, exactly what kind of market that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that on the news right now, we hear a lot of the talking heads say we'll probably be in a recession by the beginning of next year, but it's entirely possible we could be in a recession right now. And this morning, I saw the headline for the consumer spending is actually negative, much more so than they had anticipated in May, I think it was. So, well, we've always liked to give a little bit of perspective here. So, we saw on the GDP that we came out of the COVID recession really strongly. And in fact, we lost about 25 million jobs in 2 months. The recession for the COVID shutdown recession really did put a huge damper on the economy for a while, particularly with the jobs. And that's, of course, why the government sort of tried to help prop up the economy with so much spending. Well, the reason I have this circle and the 158.5 million jobs is that's just about where we were in February of 2020, right before the recession, the pandemic recession shutdown hit. So it's taken us a good 2 years to cover those jobs. But I think the interesting part is now that we hit that recovery mark, you see there hasn't been much improvement. It's been stagnating here for the last several months, and the unemployment rate can't get much lower than it is. So we're also hitting bottom here.
Right, absolutely. And the unemployment rate, within our category of engineers, architects, is within the professional and related occupations as tracked by the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it is down to 1.7%. Now, we've been at ACEC, we've been tracking this for quite a while, and this is the first time that it's come below 2%. So, generally, economists say that if unemployment is below 4%, you're at maximum employment. And so at 1.7%, we just have a lot. And we'll talk about this a little bit further in our presentation. We're hurting for people. We do not have enough people for our open positions. So, that's sort of counterintuitive to the concept of a recession. But, that is sort of where we're at right now. And, we talked a lot about this during our most recent ACEC annual convention, and our roundtables. Definitely the most significant issue of our member firms is finding people and bringing them on board.
Yeah. And I remember last quarter when we talked, it was 2.2%. So again, it's really interesting that it's fallen. What's really critical here to consider is not just that historical perspective of the jobs and the unemployment rate in the last couple of years, but the labor force participation rate. So we're at full employment right now by any economist standards, but it's really interesting that if you look at where we were right before COVID hit, we were at 63.4% participation rate, and we have not recovered. What this means is that even though we're at full employment in terms of how unemployment is calculated, when you look at the raw numbers of the people in the country who are able to work, we still are below the percentage where we were. And that means 2 million jobs. There are 2 million people that are just sitting on the sidelines relative to where we were right before the pandemic. And we've gotten questions about where did these folks go? Who are they? We know some of them, Erin, you were telling me some of them are likely baby boomers who just decided, I'm going to go ahead and retire. And what else do you think is going on there?
I think it's definitely demographically related in large part. We are in the different econ conferences I've attended recently. The talk about demographics is so interesting and how that really moves. It moves the housing market and it moves the labor force. So baby boomers are getting to that age where they're retiring, and maybe the pandemic and sort of a different kind of workplace model sped some of that up. We also know about, women and others who are in caretaking roles and perhaps can't find daycare or other sort of care because of the employment issues and the low rates, have had to take a step back perhaps. And then also another issue, and our advocacy team at ACEC is tackling this from a government affairs perspective in large part, is the immigration and the visa and some of the other, tightening that has happened over the last, 5+ years is really starting to result in us seeing, when you hold back on those kinds of visas, whether, for education or for workforce, it can have an effect of us not having the population that we need to serve in all of the jobs that we have available. And so, it's really a couple different dynamics that are at play here.
Yeah, and one other thing that I don't think we've mentioned this before, and it has to be a part of this issue, is the number of people who have died from COVID is over 1 million people. Now, the majority of those are older Americans, but you still have a lot of people who were in the workforce who have simply passed away from the pandemic. And then you have a lot of others who have long COVID. And I personally know several who are not working because of that. So I think there's, as you said, there's a lot of issues wrapped up in that number. Yeah. Well, what is all this resulting in? Really, we have a tight labor market. We have had supply chain issues. We have inflation now that started, shortly after the pandemic, but it has surged past where anyone thought it might last summer. And I know you and I, Aaron, we were saying last summer, we don't see this as transitory, and it certainly hasn't been. So we were right about that. And the thing to be aware of when we're talking about inflation, and we don't have the full, perspective here, but the last big recession in 2008 actually is a really good model of what happens during a recession. You get a top out of inflation and then inflation falls. So this is why a lot of economists are saying we have to almost go into a recession, because there's almost no other way to get inflation to come down from such high levels.
Right. It's what optimistic economists say, well, if we could only have a soft landing, right? So sort of like landing the plane from, this sort of crazy pandemic spending where we spent so much on goods and we had supply chain issues. Now we're, in the housing market was so booming that a lot of the goods were related to people buying new homes and filling the new homes with appliances and refrigerators and that sort of thing. And the savings rate was high. And so you were more likely to spend on goods. You couldn't go out to eat, couldn't go on vacation. So now that the economy is diversifying, we're still seeing inflation at that really high level. So, how it comes down and whether it comes down so that it's a harder landing into a negative GDP and into a recession versus a soft landing is still sort of TBD, but it definitely needs to come down. And, that is the mission of the Fed that is in the news today.
Yeah. And we've had historically low interest rates for a long time. We're going to talk about that in a few slides. But not only is inflation surging to the highest levels we've seen in 40 years, but we also see from the ACEC Engineering Business Sentiment Survey that perceptions and concerns about inflation from firms in the industry has jumped dramatically. So we use what's called a net rating, and this net rating is simply the agree percentage or the positive percentage subtracted from the negative percentage. So here it's 89% minus 4%, you get 85. So you theoretically can't go over plus 100 and lower than negative 100. So right now, when it says a plus 85, you can't get much more concern about inflation impacting my firm in the coming year. This is about as bad as it's going to get. So this is a very, very serious concern right now.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, when we think about inflation, we think about all the different ways it impacts spending. But when you think about it from the perspective of an engineering or architecture firm, it affects the price of wages, the price that you have to pay people. That is that is what we're selling. That is what we do as a professional service. But it also impacts some of our business costs. So gasoline and fuel prices, for example, especially if you're a firm that does a lot of site work, or has surveying, geotech, other kinds of work that's out in the field, that is also a business cost that is impacting. So inflation, while, 70% of the US economy is about consumer spending, it still has an impact on professional services firms such as ours.
We have a question, Aaron, here. How much inflation do we think is due to the massive government stimulus spending during the pandemic? I'm going to take a shot at this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well. The thing is, the government has been pumping money into the economy since the 2008 financial meltdown. So I have been saying for over a decade that, we've had too much money flowing into the economy from deficit spending. So I don't think that this is just limited to pandemic stimulus. I think this has been in the works for a very long time. And it's not just stimulus spending from the pandemic. People couldn't work during the pandemic. And I don't know that there was a lot of choice but to have some stimulus spending. I think you can debate whether it was too much or not, but I don't think we could have not had any. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think we have to also keep in mind when we identify or define what stimulus it is, it's just not payments to individuals or payments to state and local governments. It's also, forgiven PPP loans. That's also a stimulus activity. So, and that I mentioned that because it's directly, impacted our industry, as we did benefit from that program quite a bit. So I think the pandemic was such an unknown, kind of event. And, there was a sort of an urgency on behalf of the federal government to make sure that, we didn't fall into, a deeper recession, or we weren't able to climb out of it. So all of that stimulus enabled us to climb out of the pandemic recession in one quarter. However, we've climbed out of it with this high inflation. And so, every recession or every economic event is a little bit different. This is very different from the housing crisis, of 15 years ago, but it is, it's definitely something that we probably won't see again. So,
and supply chain constraints because of the pandemic, that was a major cause for the start of inflation.
Yeah.
So you can't point to just one factor. There's a lot of factors at play here. So why don't we move on to your next here, Erin?
So anyone listening to the news today, and I checked my phone right before we got on the Zoom, the Fed has not shared yet how much they're going to raise their base interest rate that impacts other interest rates. But, it is speculated that they could raise the interest rate today by 0.75, which will be they have not done that since 1994. So it's been a long time, the last time they did it, or they could do 0.5. Honestly, for our member firms, I don't know that this makes much of a difference. This is something that is very much tracked by the stock market, very much tracked by analysts. But in general, when you look at the big picture, what this really means is that, the cost of money will be higher. And if the cost of money is higher, it will slow down, hopefully, all of this inflation growth. The Fed only has really a dual mandate, two things that it has to worry about. One is having the goal of maximum employment, which clearly we have maximum employment. And the other one is, stable prices and creating, and really the tool is interest rates. And, as many economists say, it's not a scalpel, it's a hammer. So, it's not a tool that necessarily is going to do things in a subtle way or in a precise way. It's a way that, will just get it done. And so I think that we'll probably be 0.75. We'll know soon. And it's just a matter of us sort of taking the medicine at this point. And, the Fed is coming under a lot of blame and scrutiny for not raising rates faster and quicker. And so they're playing a little bit game of catch up, frankly. And, that's never a great position to be in, and some of this is also a hesitancy to raise rates because we, in the last 10 or 20 years, have had a culture of very low, interest rates compared to what we had before. So, and Joe, you inserted this slide to give us that kind of context on, what has been a 30-year fixed mortgage rate traditionally, it hasn't sat below 4%, except really in our very present times.
Yeah, I think, we can all sit back and be armchair quarterbacks, right? And we can say, oh, I wouldn't have run that play. And sure, I would have started that tightening a lot sooner, a lot more aggressively last summer when we hit inflation rates that we hadn't seen since 2008. But again, nobody can really predict the future, and we're using our best guesses. So yeah, this is a really, really interesting slide. We after the pandemic, the rates fell even further from already historically low levels. And so it's just when you have this long, decades long decline overall in interest rates, and all of a sudden they shoot up, by double.
So quickly, right?
So quickly, it's gonna hurt. It's gonna stop things, and the housing market is going to pull back. I can't predict whether prices will fall, but it's definitely already slowing down. And that's the intention here.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, really what we're here to talk about is how does this impact engineering and architecture firms and firms within our industry? And, obviously, when we look back at the data points that we receive, things are not always in present time, but as far as our most recent data points, things are still going really, really well. So just within the last week, the census released its quarterly professional services survey of different industries. And obviously we track the AE industry. And so, we were up for the 7th straight quarter. AE revenues, in Q1 of 2022 were 104 billion. So, I created this chart just to give us some context. If we look back at the last, full quarter before the pandemic, we see that we really just dipped that one quarter, and then all of that stimulus activity, the PPP loans and all of the other measures, got us right back on track. And we sort of kept clicking up ever since. And, we've had a very, very strong growth pattern since, coming out of the last recession. And I put this chart up to give us that perspective back before, the Great Recession, caused by a completely different circumstance of largely of housing, so that folks can see, we had sort of been clicking our way up. And then in the second half of 2008, things declined. And we really sat very flat until about 2014. And we've been on a really strong growth pattern ever since. And many of our firms are continuing to have, the best quarter ever, the best year ever, from what we have heard. How that will be, going forward over the next year or so, we will see, and we'll discuss that a little bit, as part of our recent survey.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting here, Erin, is we clearly are seeing some signs of trouble in the U.S. economy. The data we've presented already shows that. So here, when we go back to the sentiment survey, and again, these are net ratings, these are the percentage of firms who are net are positive about each of these areas. Now, you definitely see that decline in positive perception, the decline in optimism regarding the U.S. economy. So this makes perfect sense right here. But it's almost, what we're not seeing that follow through to the AE industry yet. Now, and I think a big part of that, as you've mentioned, Erin, is the IIJA. That is kind of an insurance policy.
It might be a little bit of an insurance policy for our little shield. We might find ourselves in a circumstance where, compared to other industries, we're going to enter potentially a recession, and we already have a spending program that passed in November of last year, became law, and is going to go on for the next 6 years. And, one number that we look at closely, which we will continue to look at, is construction put in place. And this includes design spending. So it's design and construction spending. And when we just compare the most recent month that we have data for, which is April, year over year, we're still up over 12%. And most of that, and it was up last year, it was up the year before, is residential. So, last year when we compared 2021 over 2020, we were up 23%. So it's come down a little bit. Month over month, we're only up 18% in residential, but residential is still booming. Now, with these interest rates going up, even though they're still, in the 5s, maybe they're hovering at about 6, does that mean that people really aren't going to buy houses? Or demographically, we do have a larger millennial population. They still want to, purchase homes. We're also seeing a recovery right now of private non-residential spending that dipped during the pandemic, and public spending was flat and declined a little bit, and now it's sort of inching back up. And we do expect that public spending will keep going up as that IIJ money gets spent. So what I did here is just a quick analysis of design and construction spending the first 4 months of this year compared to the first 4 months of last year, because we are in a seasonal industry, just to see, which markets were hot and which markets are sort of cold. So, what's really interesting on the left side is sort of our hot markets, the ones that have grown the fastest year over year for that winter, spring number. Manufacturing facilities growing, and I think this is a response to, because of the supply chain issues for the last couple of years, because of a push to onshore a lot of manufacturing, we are seeing the US invest in manufacturing domestically, which is important. Commercial, which includes retail, it includes industrial, which is still the hottest market. Warehouse space is up 20% year over year. Residential, again, is up over 18%. And then conservation and development, which is like levees, stormwater facilities, that's up, as well as water, wastewater, sewage and waste disposal is what census calls it. It's natural that that's up, in part because of the residential. You have to build that water, wastewater infrastructure. Now, the markets that are in the decline, which was definitely the story coming out of the pandemic in 2020, but remains the story, are these markets that are really where public interaction or interaction of large groups of people couldn't happen during the pandemic. So public safety, which includes corrections, lodging, because of business travel, has not necessarily come back. Religious, facilities is, although it's a small market, is our number 3 market down. In education, which is down still a little bit. And then transportation non-highway, which is largely airports. So, these are the markets where design and construction spending is still declining. So it'll be very interesting to see as we sort of resume into a new economy where maybe people are doing more virtual things still, how that impacts, the built environment and how we spend on design and construction. So we can overall be up, but is the built environment going to reflect sort of a paradigm shift to a new, more virtual world?
Yeah, and I think, Erin, when we look at the hot markets over the last year, especially residential, it seems like a year from now, this slide's going to probably look pretty different. What do you think about that?
I think it will look different. I think one of the things that will be interesting is we know demographically that we have a housing shortage in this country and that the millennial generation is a large generation. We also know that there are a lot of institutional investors that have begun purchasing single family and other sort of smaller properties, not just your normal apartment investors, big multifamily investors, but smaller investors, your Blackstones, et cetera, who are going into the single family rental market. So I would not be surprised if we don't see the residential number. It'll calm down from 23%. That's very high. But I think if we crawl into the data a little bit more, we might see that the multifamily or the ownership of that asset class will change because the demand is still going to be there. And people may be inclined to think, wow, I'm not taking out a mortgage at 6 or 7%. I'm going to go rent an apartment and I'll wait for them to come down because, in their lifetime, especially for a millennial, having a 6% mortgage seems high. So, I think the demand will remain for that for the residential asset, but how that asset is financed, how consumers, whether they rent or buy, may change.
And the other thing I saw, and this was a surprising number for most economists, was in May, we saw housing starts and permits increase unexpectedly. And, home builders are pretty smart folks, right? They know what they need to do to adjust to the market. So if their interest rates are going up, they're probably, to keep those starter homes and first homes affordable, they're going to pull back on some of the things that maybe they've included in the past. Maybe the size of the homes is not going to continue to increase, So I think the home builders, I feel like they will adjust to the market.
Yeah, it's definitely, there are a lot of controls in place that were not in control before the Great Recession that hopefully will keep that market from ever having the kind of bubbles that we saw before.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah.
Well, when we look at sort of what's hot, what's not from the sentiment perspective, it's kind of mirrors what you're seeing, Erin, in a lot of ways. We still see, so let's just sort of dissect this slide for a minute. There's a lot of numbers on here. So each of these are the market sectors or the industry sectors in our industry. And for now, we've been conducting this survey for 3 quarters. So you see 3 quarters worth of data here. And then on the right side, you see the change from the previous quarter. So the first thing you notice is, all right, well, about half of these have improved and half of them have declined. The other thing you notice here is with the blue circles with Q2, these are the top 4. So we see water, wastewater. You just mentioned that, Aaron. We see energy and utilities. We see transportation at airports. And that's a little bit different than what you were seeing.
Yeah. And that I think is because our members are thinking about IIJA. There's a lot of money in there for airports, right? And I was in an airport this past weekend coming back from vacation, and it was packed. But
Right.
it's not business travelers. So, but I think it will come back.
Yeah, and I think we're definitely seeing here a lot of the impact of IIJA. We know that it's already starting to be felt by firms. We had a question about that in the sentiment survey, which we didn't include here, but about 1/5 of firms are already reporting they're seeing work from the IIJA, and a total of around 80% say they expect to see positive impacts from IIJA. So I think you're right. This is definitely sort of telling us, we're starting to see some of the impacts here. Now, what's interesting though, is when you look at what has seen a decline in the net ratings, we see residential land development, healthcare facilities, telecommunications, data centers. So some of these areas that had been hotter in the past pandemic are starting to maybe slow a little bit.
And I think that's looking into the future. We know that that's not the actuality. I was surprised in our survey to see folks have a more negative view of telecom and broadband, because that is, we'll show a slide later, that is a market that's going to get a lot of investment through IIJA. So I think that was a bit of a surprise to me. But
well, and the other thing to keep in mind, these numbers are still super strong. I mean, and this is current industry sentiment, right? So all of these are still positive, and the most of them are well above 50. I mean, again, the best you can get here is a plus 100. So we're not near negative territory yet. And I think that's important, again, to keep that perspective in mind. All right, so a couple other metrics that we are tracking over time is current backlog. This is one of them. And we see that backlog has improved in this quarter from 10 to 11 months. That's the median. And this is also, comparatively speaking, when we were in the middle of the COVID recession, that fell to 6. So we have really come back a long ways here. And you see that more firms are reporting a backlog of a year or more compared to the last quarter and the quarter previously. So this still says, hey, you know, overall things are still solid in the industry right now. And then when we look at the median number of open positions, so that workforce issue, we're seeing that increase. This ties right into your data, Aaron, where you saw the unemployment rate is down to 1.7%. And what's really interesting here is that for smaller firms, those with 1 to 50 FTE, they're sort of maintaining the number of open positions. They haven't increased. But on the large firms, the 500 FTE or more, they're having a really hard time filling the number of open positions. There's people who are leaving the firms, they can't fill those spots, and they're also anticipating the growth. They're actually telling us they're seeing growth from IIJA already. The largest firms are the ones who are seeing that growth first. So you see the median number of open positions has surged in this group category. It's crazy.
It is. I mean, this is definitely the #1 hot topic at our convention, at our in-person roundtables that we had a few weeks back. You know, it's not a surprise that large firms, you know, have a greater percentage of openings. They have more flexibility to sort of be able to carry people, you know, that may not be utilized right away. And so, you know, obviously we hope all firms of all sizes are going to benefit from IIJA. Large firms do have, you know, sort of a little bit more cushion usually to have some people in the wings than smaller firms. But, you know, certainly the #1 concern of our members is workforce. And, you know, where there's competition, there's price increases. So, you know, that really plays into all of the other things we're talking about connected to inflation and price wage sort of connected escalations.
Yeah, if the #1 concern is workforce, the #2 is inflation and salary increases.
Yeah.
So we asked this question in the most recent quarter, how many firms have seen an increase? Well, 9 out of 10 say that the average salary at their firm has increased in the last year. That's the same, by the way, as what we saw 3 months ago. However, 3 months ago, we saw an average employee increase in salary of around 5%.
Right.
This quarter, we asked it in terms of new hires versus existing staff. Both are well above that 5%
Right.
that we saw just 3 months ago. So we're seeing these prices going way up. And again,
Right.
surprising if unemployment in the industry is 1.7%. There is some fierce competition
Yeah.
to get that talent right now.
Right. I mean, if your existing staff knows that, they could move somewhere else, even if they don't want to, and especially at certain, points in an engineer or staff member's career, if they have, 5, 10, 12 years of experience, they're still building their family. They're still building, their household equity. Often a pay increase of even 10% can make such of a difference. Unfortunately, these are also the level of staff that most of our member firms really need to execute a lot of the work and to stay engaged with their member firms. So, it is really a tough situation for a lot of firms that find themselves in. And that's why I think we're seeing that existing staff, median raise of 7%, much higher than, your typical 3% that we would normally see. And where this really also impacts firms is, as a former business development director and capture manager, we often propose and price out a project months, if not, for some IDIQ type contracts, a year or two in advance. So if all of a sudden, your pricing strategy does not work, or especially in an industry like ours where our profit margins can be very slim, it can create really a lot of concern. So
yeah, and it's the inflation in the general economy with energy prices, food prices, these hit every American.
Right.
Now, the lower your salary, the harder it's hitting you proportionally, but it's hitting everyone.
It's hitting everyone. So even if your existing staff person is getting a 7% raise, or you change positions, or someone on your staff changes positions within firms and gets a 10% raise, because of the consumer inflation that we see, it's not resulting in more money because the cost of living has gone up. So, it is sort of a spiral effect.
And this is why we need the Fed to cool down.
Right.
We have to.
Yes.
We absolutely have to, because when you get in these inflationary spirals, it's very hard to get out of it. So the sooner, the better in terms of tamping down inflation.
Right.
And
prices can go down, but people don't take salary reductions. So.
Exactly. And so to your point, Erin, when you're pricing in, your escalation clauses, this is something that firms are used to doing. We see that 67% of firms do this with multi-year clients, but it's very, very different when you talk about the 1 to 25 FTE firm, which 39% of them say they use escalation clauses, versus 500 plus FTE, which 91% of them build in these clauses.
Right. That's really interesting. Yeah.
And even if you're a larger firm and you can build these in, you can only build in between 2 and 4%. Right. That median is about 3%, Erin.
Right. Well, maybe some of our smaller firms that may be listening in are thinking to themselves, well, I need to be a little more aggressive in revisiting how I do my escalation and my price proposals. But certainly, a typical escalation clause of 2 or 4% is not going to meet the moment if you're giving folks a 7% raise or a 10%, onboarding new folks at a 10% increase. So, that's definitely something that's going to have to even out. Hopefully, will be rebalanced over the next couple of years.
Yeah. And it will take time. It will take time to get inflation to come back down. But that's, I think, why it's so important to get on top of that now.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we talked about the current state of the economy, and the overall U.S. economy is not so hot at the moment. Everyone's very concerned, yet the industry is holding up. The industry is still staying strong. And so what's going to happen in the next year or so? Well, this is just a reminder of our forecast. Now, this forecast is about 9 months old, and we will be updating this forecast in the fall. So look for that, because obviously a lot has changed just in the last 9 months.
Right.
But when we look at the forecast from last year that we put out, we saw not the dotted line, but the solid line was our baseline forecast. The IIJA was still in discussion and had not yet been passed. And so we estimated what that would look like. So now our current forecast is that dotted line because the IIJA passed. So we're still looking at extremely strong growth overall in the industry. The question is how and if the rest of the economy is going to affect this, and what will inflation do in terms of the real purchasing power, the real buying power of the government here?
Yeah, I think we've been asked this question, from some different sources recently on, what is the inflationary impact on the IIJA spend. I will say, that's a very hard question to answer. And it's a hard question to answer for a couple reasons. One is that, as our engineers and designers that are listening in know, when you're talking about a project cost, say, a roadway project that's, $1 billion, or a bridge project that's $1 billion, the percentage that is going to AE firms is a single-digit percentage of that total project cost. So the total project cost will change based on, the price of steel, the price of other materials, the price of labor. But it can be very hard for us to identify the exact impact because we are a pretty small slice of that total construction cost. The other thing to keep in mind is that IIJA is a spend it's not all coming in the next 12 months. It's a spend over a 6-year period. And so as we watch what the Fed does today, what happens, with regards to monetary policy over the next, year or so, it will impact, the price of materials, the price of labor, and all of those inputs that, will adjust, whether it goes up or down, what the economic impact is of IIJA. So, it's something that I'm glad we're updating, but it is something that kind of will continue to change over time.
Yeah. And just as a reminder, the IIJA is going to result in an additional 82,000 jobs being needed. So this is going to continue to put some pressure on firms to staff up to handle the project.
Yeah. I mean, we may find ourselves in a very unique position compared to other industries that if we do enter a recession and we see an economic slowdown, will we be shielded a bit from that slowdown because we have this stimulus coming over the next, 5 or so years?
Yeah. And I think that the answer is yes, but the degree to which is still up in the air.
And it really depends, perfect timing for this chart, on what market you're in. So, if you're a land development firm and, you're like, oh, I know I have, 20 open positions listed on my website, but maybe I'm only going to hire a couple people and I'm going to hold off, that's completely acceptable because, the housing market may slow. But if you're a firm that's very public focused, or you're very diversified and you're doing a lot of work around these markets that are going to get an IIJA spend, your planning and your thinking about what might happen in the next year or two may be quite different. So, we like to share this slide just to remind folks of, where the IIJA money is going to go. And also, it's always interesting for Joe and I to look at this and then think about how you all, answered that sentiment slide with regards to different markets that you're excited about or think are very optimistic.
So, Erin, one question while we're still on this slide. With large firms, are they going to be able to move some of their engineers and staff to other sectors and focus on those growth sectors? Or, if you're if you're working in the housing area, you can't really move over to transportation very easily?
I think it just depends. Honestly, it depends on your relationships and how you how you team with the firms that you constantly team with and how you work directly. For a lot of land development firms, their clients are home builders or commercial real estate developers. And, they may not have an existing client base of public clients or different clients. But for firms that are very diversified, or for larger firms that do all different kinds of work, it's much easier because you have the ability to win that work. You have those existing client relationships, and so you can move people around. If you're doing site civil for a land development project, can you also do site civil for a warehouse or for, a transportation related parking lot? Of course. There are definitely a lot of our engineers that are very, adept at being nimble. But I think, having worked in the industry for almost 20 years, where the problem is not necessarily in executing the work, it's in winning that kind of new work if it's in a market that you haven't served before or you don't have a lot of clients in. But if you're in a larger diversified firm, it's certainly easier, to be nimble with regards to that kind of market change.
Right. Okay, so we have a question about jobs, but I'm going to hold on that one for just a minute because we're going to come back to jobs in just a minute. Let's go to the next slide and look at what the sentiment 12 months ahead is. So this is member firms who are looking out 12 months from now and telling us, are they optimistic or pessimistic about each of these areas? Well, this is not a surprise, but the magnitude of the decline in terms of the condition of the U.S. economy is quite large. This was surprising to me that we are seeing the current macroeconomic conditions are beginning to concern the AE industry firms. And we're even seeing that these firms are less positive, still positive, but less positive, much less positive about the condition of the industry 12 months from now, as well, as well as their firm finances 12 months from now. Excuse me, Erin. I got to take some water here.
Yeah, and I think this is in large part, this isn't playing out yet in reality, sort of a, the negative view, but it's also our members reacting to, when they go fill their own personal gas tank or when they see their stock portfolio and their 401k decline. And so, personal sentiment, business sentiment are not always the same, but I do think that, there are certain reasons for us to feel less optimism right now than we felt before.
And we were talking about this previously, Erin. It's the uncertainty.
Right. Uncertainty.
And this can feed on itself. So even though, looking at the tea leaves at the moment, the industry is really healthy and poised to weather a recession quite well, relatively speaking. But the uncertainty that the macroeconomic outlook brings is I think what's showing up here.
Yeah.
So when we look at how is sentiment by sector forward looking, this is much different than what we are seeing currently. All of the quarter over quarter changes are negative, and many of the current quarter readings, we have 4 of them, are also now negative. So this is pessimistic outlook. And we see commercial real estate, we see residential land development. So these are 2 areas where people are saying, hey, we think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Now, the top 4 areas, not surprising, all transportation and wastewater. So again, we see that if you are in this sector where the IIJA is most targeted, you are going to be better positioned to, weather any type of recession that we see. But as Erin, you said earlier, if you're highly focused on development, you may have some challenges ahead.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so looking at our metrics for backlog, we do still see very positive outlook for backlog in terms of 12 months out, although it's starting to soften. So last quarter, 66% expected they'd see an increase in backlog over the next 12 months. Now we're seeing it at 54%. And one thing I should mention here, this is a good time to talk about this, is the full report has breakdowns by firm size as well as by geographic region. And what we're seeing right now is the pessimism is coming more from the smaller firms. The smaller firms are usually the first ones to get hit in any type of event. We saw that with COVID, and they tend to take a little longer to recover. And so I'm calling this the canary in the coal mine, that we're seeing smaller firms are much less optimistic. They are not as positive about their future backlog, and they're more concerned about the health of the industry. So this is definitely something that is working its way into the industry at the moment.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's really interesting, and we've seen this in some of our other surveys and our discussions recently with members, is you can be optimistic about the quantity or the months of your backlog, but not necessarily optimistic about your ability to manage your projects for profitability, especially in a time of wage inflation. And so, just getting a lot of work in the door, although that is a big, historically, that's one of the main objectives of a firm, and that's a big challenge. But once you get the work in the door, you also have to be able to have the right people to staff the job and manage the job to a budget and a schedule. And that budget is depending in large part upon, hourly rates and how folks manage that. So I think that backlog is a really interesting metric, and the positivity of it can still be high, as we're seeing, with still a sense of uncertainty regarding the other way you sort of manage your jobs and manage profitability.
Absolutely. And so speaking of jobs, here's our last data slide for the day. We do see that 73% of firms are still anticipating hiring growth over the next 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
So now this is down a little bit. It's softening as well, which I think is a good thing. It's such a tight labor market, and we need to even add more jobs. So we need a little bit of a slowdown here in the employment pressure.
Yeah, a slowdown will enable firms, less competition means not having to pay 10% over, and so it's sort of like on a macro level, the Fed making us take our medicine and delaying giving us the medicine. In a way, a little bit of a slowdown for many of our firms will help balance that supply and demand issue with engineers, and hopefully give us time to make sure that we can deliver on IIJA and other projects, that are going to come our way over the next couple of years.
Yeah. So that question from the audience member is, those 82,000 additional jobs, is that going to continue to add to inflation and wage pressures? And so, my read on it is yes, but the whole idea here is to try to get things to moderate. We don't want a hard landing. We want a soft landing.
Right.
I think it's more likely to happen within the AE industry because we do have some support with IIJA, but we need to have a bit of a slowdown, as you just said, because we need to add more jobs to fulfill IIJA. So we have to have a little bit of a slowdown in order to help catch up.
Right. And a lot of it is going to be pretty market specific. So the 82,000 additional jobs from IIJA are additional. But on your baseline, if certain markets are slowing down, your office market, your land development market, that's subtracting from total, AE employees when we look at it at a macro level. So, it is about balancing the supply and demand of, engineering staff and what is required, by our industry. And I think, it remains the most significant concern of our members is I cannot find the people to do the work.
Right.
And so if some of the markets slow down considerably, but we see the IIJA funded markets, continue to demand that kind of increase in jobs at 82,000, that net, increase might not be the same. And so hopefully that's the kind of balance that we'll hopefully see without a crash, a balancing without a crash.
Right. And I think that's a really good point to make, Erin. And we're going to update our forecast in the next few months. We're also going to update how many jobs we have and where they are, where they're growing, where they're not growing. So we're going to get another read on that jobs picture. And if things start to slow, or we anticipate they will, we may see, as you said, Aaron, shifting. And so maybe there will be fewer net new jobs needed compared to that 82,000. We have to wait and see as we get the modeling coming in.
Right. Yeah.
All right, so Aaron, let's recap here. And
yeah,
if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them. We do have a few minutes left, but we wanted to kind of just have a few questions here and observations to end. So one of them is that unemployment is still at like record low levels. I mean, I've never seen it in my lifetime,
right.
And we may never see it again. So historically low unemployment. And this does help to put pressure in the system. So we need to relieve that pressure. And you made this point, Aaron, that there's still buying power out there. I mean, because people are employed, because people have jobs, yeah, inflation is higher, and it will, in the end, it will result in what we call demand destruction, right?
Right,
so
right.
People just can't afford to buy all the things that they have been buying, but they're still going to buy right now.
Right. So, I mean, the reason inflate, the Fed has their tool, interest rates. The other tool is just people not spending as much. The US is like much of the world is a consumer-based economy. About 70% of what we spend our money on are consumer goods. And if people spend less money, because everything costs a little bit more, and even at a 7 or 10% wage increase, it's not enough to keep up, we'll see that supply and demand kind of even out a little bit. Right now, folks are keeping an eye on, the consumer price indexes and some other metrics just to see if behavior has changed. If people are like, well, I'm not going to take my road trip to the beach because gas is too much, or I'm not going to, eat out as much because the cost of groceries is too high. And so when we see behavioral shifts, which I think some analysts have seen a little bit of, but not enough to really see, then we will see that sort of slow things down. And
people will have to choose where they spend their money. If they're making the typical household income in the US is around 65,000, that's the median. Well, inflation is going up, but I have the same amount of money, so I just have to choose where I'm going to spend.
Or you have a job. Jokingly, people say, well, especially the Fed and some of the analysts that track that very closely say, at the end of the day, we'd rather have really low unemployment and a higher inflation than a high unemployment and low inflation. Much better for people to have a job, even if they have to pay more for their goods, than to not have a job. So, if you want to tip the scales one or the other, although as many of us would say, the scales are they're not balanced right now. So we got to get the inflation back in check, and hopefully still, employment generally, the goal is 4%. In our industry, it's at 1.6. So, hopefully that will come back and moderate as well. And the same thing for the housing market. Last year we saw 23% growth in design and construction. That's not about the cost of a house or existing house. That's in spending on building new homes. A 23% increase year over year. And there was a previous increase as well. It did not slow down during the pandemic. Means that the demand is there. Raising interest rates will soften the demand, and it will probably soften the price of homes. But demographically, we still have a large population that needs homes. And so it'll just be very interesting to see, again, how that housing market ends up looking. And is it, does the ownership shift to more rental housing? And what does that look like?
Yeah. And finally, in our last minute here, the recession watch. We may be in a technical recession right now, although it's not really feeling like a recession in terms of jobs or anything like that. But the longer term is what's going to happen within the next 6 months to 12 months. And typically the stock market is an indicator of a recession 6 months ahead of time. So I think that's what we're seeing here right now with the market, is that they're pricing in a recession. And so that's why we're hearing the talk about a recession coming in the next 6 months. So we'll see what happens. Please tune in to our next quarterly update. But for now, we're going to throw it back to Daphne.
Thanks, Joe and Aaron. Thank you all for joining us. And Joe and Aaron, thanks for sharing all the data, great insights. You always give us a lot to think about, and I know probably even more that you want to share, but we are out of time. I do want to thank those of you listening that participated in our Q2 Engineering Business Sentiment Survey. It's very valuable information, as you can see, and so we thank you for that. A special shout out to the ACEC Research Institute donors who've made this research and the roundtable possible. We invite each of you to think about how you and or your firm can participate and support the Institute as well. To get a full copy of the Q2 sentiment report, which we've been sharing bits and pieces with you today, here is a QR code that you can scan and get to the download. We will also be sending you a short evaluation this afternoon, and we appreciate if you would share your experience with us. And with that, I will sign off and say have a great afternoon, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.